Ave at Kwale, George Herbert Walker Bush. So the erstwhile President Bush has been summoned to the pearly gates. So he died a few days ago, and his funeral has just taken place. And his wife died, I think, only several months ago, and that's quite often the case. When one spouse dies, the other often follows not very long afterwards, because their lives are so intertwined and somebody loses the will to live. For elderly people, so long as they're not fatally ill, that's often it. It's the will to live which sustains them, and once that's gone, well, they often succumb. So, who was this President Bush? Of course, he's the father of George W. Bush. So the father's got Herbert as one of his middle names, and the son doesn't have Herbert. So they're not namesakes. So more about George Bush Sr. Well, he came from a Yankee aristocrat family. His father, Prescott Bush, was a senator. In the 1930s, his father did business with Germany. Michael Moore has taken aim at him on this, a bit like the Old Testament, visiting the sins of fathers on their sons and so on. So he grew up in a very affluent family, and he went to Yale. 1942, he volunteered for the U.S. Army. The Second World War was on, and he served in the Army Air Corps. Remember, the U.S. Air Force, as such, didn't exist till 1948. The Air Corps was part of the Army prior to that. And so he was a fighter pilot in the Pacific, and he was shot down, was dog paddling for a while. So that was that. He was 17, he was one of the US military's youngest aviators. So he certainly served with distinction, and he was an oil man in the late 40s and got into politics later on. He'd been a congressman. So some of the things he said in the 60s, would be regarded as scandalous these days, saying that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was a militant and so on, when a great majority of people now would say that Dr. King was a very moderate man. He was trying to achieve some reasonable aims. There were some very grave grievances that needed to be addressed, and he was a moral titan. Anyhow, he later served as director of the CIA briefly in the 70s, not during the Pinochet coup, a bit after that. So he's seen as a moderate within the Republican Party. And then this insurgent California Republican governor there, Ronald Reagan, sought the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1980, and Bush was one of his rivals. And Bush slammed Reagan's economic program as voodoo economics, saying that it's hokum, can't possibly work. How ironic it was that they ended up being stablemates, because Reagan then picked him as his running mate. So Reagan, who was most associated with California, really came from the Midwest, actually. Whereas Bush was, more associated with New England, Connecticut, or his main house in Kennebunkport in Maine, but it's worked in Texas for a long time. So they often try to have a balanced ticket, different parts of the country represented, and different stratums of society. Reagan, who'd grown up a proletarian, whereas George H.W. Bush grew up a patrician. So that was him, vice presidents. I don't want to go through all the Reagan years. The Cold War was at its height, and they ramped up tensions, and they increased defense spending by a third, kind of helping to bankrupt the Soviet Union, which just couldn't keep pace with that. The Star Wars program, the idea they could shoot down nuclear missiles in space before they impacted. What else? The Iran-Contra scandal. Well, the Iran-Iraq conflict was going on from 1980 to 88. And there were Americans who'd been taken hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a Shia militant organization backed by Iran. The United States wanted to get these people released. Congress refused to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, counter-revolutionaries, right-wingers. So Reagan wanted to fund them illegally because Congress has the power of the purse. So, and the United States was supporting Iraq in that war, selling them weapons. So, illegally selling weapons to Iran to get money to fund the Contras, and also the Iranians would persuade Hezbollah to release American hostages. But anyway, it all came out in the wash, that scandal. Should it have sunk the Reagan administration? Well, it didn't. Unemployment shot up under Reagan, who was very against welfare and obviously his vice president was going along with all this, the war on drugs. And it started to be a huge expansion in the prison population, a much more punitive approach after the relatively liberal 60s and 70s. The death penalty was brought back. So most people would say these are rather regressive policies. Inflation came down anyway. So the Cold War was won towards the end of that time. George H.W. Bush, he was elected president in 1988, took over in January 1989. And few would have imagined that the Berlin Wall would come down that November. 9th of November 1989 was the crucial day. So anyway, it was heading to a decade of American hegemony. It became a unipolar world. Of course, we didn't know this wasn't going to last. But anyway, in August 1991, the American ambassador in Iraq had said the United States takes no view of an Arab-Arab conflict. For example, your border dispute with Kuwait. It was a moronic thing to say because Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi tyrant, took that as an American green light for the annexation of Kuwait, and he went ahead and did it. So George Bush Sr. went through the UN route, getting UN resolutions, cobbling together a coalition of 35 countries, including Arab countries such as Egypt, Morocco, Syria, to liberate Kuwait. But he chose not to go all the way to Baghdad, not to oust Saddam Hussein. I thought it was the right decision at the time. And he lost his re-election to Bill Clinton, despite Bush having sky-high approval ratings right after Iraq. He'd played it masterfully, and he'd done it the legal route through the UN route. He'd quit whilst it was ahead. There were no serious losses for the United States in that. And he'd even got the Soviet Union on its side towards the end. He'd helped bring about the peaceful unification for Germany, things like that. So the economy stagnated and then fell. There was that early 90s recession, and that's really what paid for him. As Bill Clinton would to say, it was the economy stupid. Other bad things about him is in 88 he'd stood against Michael Dukakis, Greek-American governor of Massachusetts, and scorned him, saying, no, your opinion sounds like something from Harvard Yard, appealing to anti-establishment prejudice, even though Bush was much more of an establishment scion than Dukakis. Other things, he endlessly ran these Willie Horton ads, some sort of early release scheme Dukakis had in Massachusetts. This man got out of prison early and committed a murder. Well, that's what's bad about Dukakis. And in 92, Clinton was not going to be outflanked. He was governor of Arkansas. He made a great point of flying back to Arkansas during the campaign to sign the death warrant for the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, who was mentally subnormal. Some people say he shouldn't have been put to death. He didn't realise what murder was. He had the mind of a toddler. So he lost the election to Clinton. He couldn't believe it. Clinton was a draft dodger, and he'd served gallantly. Bush had served gallantly in the Second World War and been rejected. But there we were. The generational moment had changed. First president born after the war, being elected. In the dying days of the Bush administration, he launched operations to restore hope, sending troops into Somalia on a UN program to try and deliver food, defeat some of the warlords, and that was that right to the end. Anyway, it wasn't very successful. Black Hawk Down, about 20 Americans were killed, and the new President Clinton withdrew within months to almost universal approval. Decades later, some people think that was the wrong decision. So, Bush might seem to be cut from the same cloth as Trump. They were both WASPs, born into very affluent families, and hetero Republicans, and born 22 years apart. And the grand sweep of history, 22 years is nothing. But we see what a degeneration in politics there's been in that time. Bush, whatever you think of his policies, was gracious, self-restrained, even self-deprecating, undemonstrative, impeccably turned out, refined. The consummate gentleman. There was a lot to be said for him. He was reasonably erudite without being an ivory tower idealist. He was someone who sought to be expedient, things like that. In that respect, was a credit to his country, and had ample experience as a congressman, as director of the CIA, as ambassador to China, was worldly advised, and all the rest of it. Sought the advice of experts, could accept it when he was wrong, things like that. Wasn't so erratic, wasn't changing policy from one day to the next. The one thing he broke his promise on was on tax. Read my lips, no new taxes, when he was elected in 1988. But then he was obliged to tear that up. The Democrats applauded him for doing so, but he won no plaudits from the public. Perhaps he should have done. And you see, whereas Trump cares nothing for the national interest, proposing tax cuts, even if these are going to be cataclysmic for the country, just to please his billionaire buddies. Well, I came from a very different era, an era where the notion of public service was not scorned as it is by Trump. The thing that marred his declining years with George Bush Sr. was these allegations of sexual harassment. Did he touch up female staffers? I'm not sure. But he died at the age of 94, so presumably he was gaga, didn't really know what he's doing, can't really hold it against him, what he's doing right at the end of his life. He was a family man, he was happily married, he had 5 children, if I've got that right. The death of his infant daughter affected him deeply, and I suppose drew him closer to his wife. He'd also been to, I think it's Phillips Andover, one of the elite prep schools. The United States prep school is for those aged 14 to 18. So very, very different from Trump, who was obviously consorting with prostitutes and so on. See how much worse Americans and politicians have gone. Well, didn't have a great deal of time for this man's policies, but he will be missed.